Her words struck like a thrown stone. "Don't touch anything with those animal hands." The sentence sliced through the quiet interior of the sedan before either of them had time to breathe, and for a moment, the only sound that followed was the soft hum of the engine carrying them through the city night. Malcolm Hayes kept both hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed forward, even as the insult settled in the air between them like dust refusing to fall. Behind him, Evelyn Lockhart, CEO of Lockhart Dynamics, shoved aside a trembling strand of hair and returned to the chaos of her collapsing world, unaware that she had just spoken the line that would unmake her life and rebuild it at the same time. The luxury sedan drifted past rows of office towers, their windows still glowing with the last lights of exhausted workers. Evelyn's voice cracked as she shouted into her phone, trying to steady the wreckage of a merger worth $1.4 billion. It was more than a deal. It was the only lifeboat for a company running out of time. Every interpreter service across the city had confirmed they were fully booked. The visiting delegation from Maraita Bhandari Holdings would land in 75 minutes. With them came the possibility of saving 240 jobs, along with the last fragments of Lockhart Dynamics' survival. Malcolm said nothing. He had survived long enough in this role to know that silence was the safest companion for a man in a driver's seat. The insult still echoed in his mind, but the hurt was not new. It had been 4 years of comments spoken as if he weren't there. 4 years of briefcases tossed into the front seat like discarded objects. 4 years of seeing his reflection in the rearview mirror only in the moments she chose to be angry. Still, this time felt different. There had been an edge to her voice, a fear beneath the cruelty, a strain he had not heard before. Evelyn continued dialing call after call, begging for an interpreter in Japanese, Mandarin, or Hindi, anything that could keep the meeting alive. She slammed her phone against the leather seat when yet another voicemail greeted her. "I don't care what it costs. Find someone. Anyone." The sentence trembled, as if each word might crumble under the weight of her panic. Through the mirror camera mounted above the dashboard, Malcolm watched her pace in the back seat. Her perfectly constructed exterior, icy leadership, immaculate hair, precise diction had begun to break. Mascara smeared beneath her eyes. A thread loosened in her blazer. Her voice rose, fell, cracked. For the first time, she looked small. Not weak, not fragile, just human and terribly, painfully alone. He could have turned the radio down earlier without her permission. He knew she'd been struggling to hear through the chaos of her own heartbeat. But even a simple touch on the console had been enough to provoke the insult. So he kept his hands in his lap, fingers unmoving, until one vibrating burst of desperation slid into the next. At last, when she cried out that the deal, their survival, was slipping away for good, Malcolm reached carefully toward the part of the dashboard closest to her voice. Evelyn snapped. "Keep your hands off my car. You're the help. Stay in your lane." And then came the final cut. "I'm tired of seeing your face. Put the partition up." Malcolm pressed a button and watched the glass rise. The sound was gentle, almost polite, a soft hiss that belied the sharpness of what it represented. The barrier lifted between them like a curtain sealing off a stage. On her side, power. On his, silence. He was visible enough to drive her, but invisible where it mattered. When the partition locked into place, Evelyn resumed her frantic calls. The narration softened as we linger on Malcolm's side of the car. The quiet rhythm of the road beneath the wheels, the faint reflection of passing buildings across the window. the calm breathing of a man who had once stood behind presidents in rooms where nations negotiated their futures. The world had once trusted him to carry meaning across 10 languages. Tonight, he was expected to sit still. Malcolm's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he listened to Evelyn crumble. She pleaded with the head of legal to rewrite contract language, begged her assistant to call another agency, whispered under her breath that she had 3 months, no, now barely 5, for the company to stay afloat. She muttered about payroll cycles she no longer had the funds to meet. Her voice shook when she said the delegation might refuse to meet her at all if they felt slighted. He had heard rumors of Lockhart Dynamics' declining revenue, but tonight, in the dim glow of the dashboard, he heard the truth in her voice. They were out of time. He lowered his eyes to his hands. These hands had once held documents marked confidential in 4 different alphabets. They had gestured calmly during crisis talks that prevented entire industries from collapsing. They had carried a mother through her worst days of treatment and a daughter through the years she worked toward medical school. Yet tonight, they had been told not to touch the radio. The next moment happened almost without his conscious decision. The partition switch sat just to the right of his hand. He brushed a thumb lightly against it. A soft click. The glass began to descend. Evelyn whipped around, eyes ablaze. "I told you." Malcolm's voice was steady, quiet, and unshaken. "Ms. Lockhart, what languages do you need?" Silence. Not the harsh, cutting silence of before. This one landed differently, startled, sharp, suspended in the air. Her mouth fell open. "I'm sorry. What did you just—" "For your meeting," he continued, his tone as gentle as someone offering a glass of water. "Tell me what languages you need." Something inside her wavered, as if her mind could not reconcile the calm, composed voice with the man she'd spent 4 years overlooking. Her panic flickered into a moment of disbelief. "Japanese," she whispered, "and Mandarin, maybe Hindi, possibly Korean." Malcolm nodded. "All right," she blinked. "All right? What does that mean?" He met her eyes briefly through the mirror. "I speak those." Her breath caught. "You speak what? Those 3? "Those 5, he answered softly. "Plus Arabic, Portuguese, French, German, Spanish, and one more I hardly ever mention." Before Evelyn could process the revelation, her phone rang again. The screen lit up with the name she most feared to see, Moreta Bhandari Holdings. She went pale. "I can't take this without an interpreter," she whispered. Malcolm turned slightly toward her reflection. His voice was calm in a way that suggested still water over something very deep. "May I answer?" Evelyn hesitated, pride pressing against desperation. The phone kept ringing. Her hand trembled as she held it out. Malcolm accepted it gently, lifted it to his ear, and spoke in flawless Japanese with the kind of ease one only gains from years spent bridging nations. And just like that, the glass wall between them began quietly to crack. The city faded behind them as the car eased into the underground garage of Lockhart Dynamics, the overhead lights humming softly like a tired chorus. Malcolm parked with the same practiced precision he'd used every day for 4 years. Yet tonight, the familiar space felt strangely unfamiliar. The engine stilled, a quiet settled, one that held its breath, waiting to see what the next sentence between them might change. Evelyn Lockhart didn't move. She sat rigid in the back seat, hands still trembling from the call Malcolm had just saved. Her eyes were fixed on him through the mirror, filled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and something she rarely allowed herself to feel in front of anyone: vulnerability. For the first time since he'd started driving her, she didn't bark an order, didn't rush out, didn't dismiss him. She simply whispered, barely audible, How do you know those languages?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed his hands gently on the wheel, not gripping it, but resting there as if acknowledging the years those hands had spent in silence. "It's a long story, Ms. Lockhart," he said softly. "Well," she replied, voice cracking in the stillness, "we have a few minutes." For the first time since she'd ordered the partition up, there was no wall between them. Only the slow, steady rhythm of their combined breathing, the garage lights reflecting faintly along the chrome lining of the dashboard. Malcolm leaned back slightly, allowing his memories to rise with the quiet. "I wasn't always behind a steering wheel," he began, his voice carrying the warmth of a story long held in silence. "After Stanford, I spent years at Georgetown, earning a doctorate that taught me not just how countries negotiate, but why. From there, I studied applied linguistics at Harvard. I wanted to understand how words shift hearts, not just documents." He paused, letting the image settle. Evelyn listened with an intensity she rarely offered anyone. Her makeup had smeared beneath her eyes, but she didn't bother wiping it. She looked like someone who was finally realizing how much she had failed to see. "I spent 25 years in foreign service," Malcolm continued. "I wasn't visible to the public, but my voice carried the weight of nations. Sometimes that meant translating technical terms into something diplomats could understand. Sometimes it meant capturing fear, hope, and hesitation inside a single sentence so both sides would hear the truth instead of the noise." The narrator follows his voice gently, softening what could have been sharp or technical. Instead of discussing complex geopolitical equations, Malcolm speaks only in stories. How in Tokyo, he once guided a negotiation so delicate that a single misinterpreted phrase could have unraveled years of progress. How in Beijing, he helped bridge conversations between engineers, trying to align inventions built on entirely different assumptions. How in Geneva, he stood at the edges of climate discussions, capturing tones that meant more than the words themselves. Evelyn swallowed. "And presidents? You said, back there, you translated for multiple presidents?" Malcolm nodded once. "4 of them. All different, but all aware of how much depends on saying the right thing in the right way. They trusted me to carry their words without changing their meaning. They trusted me enough to stand behind them in rooms where a single mistake could reshape global trade." The words were gentle, not proud, simply the truth. The car suddenly felt too small, too fragile to contain the life he was revealing. "So why?" Evelyn whispered. "Why are you here? Why are driving?" She didn't ask it cruelly this time. There was no disbelief, no sting, only genuine confusion wrapped in regret. Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly. He looked down at his hands again, tracing invisible timelines across his palms. "My mother, Beatrice. Her cancer treatments were expensive. The kind of expensive that doesn't wait. At the same time, my daughter Maya got into medical school, pediatric oncology. She wanted to help children the way she helped her grandmother through treatment." He inhaled slowly, letting a soft breath calm the ache still woven through the memory. "They downsized my department, a budget cut. I had 2 weeks to find income before the first treatment bill was due. I applied everywhere I could, 300 places, maybe more. Consulting firms thought I was too senior. Universities thought I was too specialized. Corporations thought I was too expensive. I'd spent decades being the person powerful people listened to, and then suddenly, No one did. The narrator slows here, giving space to the truth. A man who once translated the language of nations had been reduced to a ghost in corporate hallways. A resume too impressive to be hired. A mind too experienced to be considered useful. So when Lockhart Dynamics needed a driver, Malcolm continued, it was the first job that would start paying within 2 weeks. I promised myself it was temporary. Just until my mother was stable. Just until Maya settled in school. Just until something better came along. Evelyn lowered her gaze, shame rippling through her posture. All this time, and Malcolm shook his head gently before she could finish. You were busy saving a company. I was busy saving a family. We both did what we had to do. The softness in his voice caught her off guard. He wasn't accusing her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even bitter. He was simply telling his story the way a tired man lays down a heavy suitcase after carrying it longer than he meant to. Evelyn pressed a hand to her forehead. But the things I said, the way I talked to you all these years. For me, Malcolm replied quietly. Every morning started with the same thought. This is temporary. Every disrespect, every dismissal, every time you threw your briefcase into the front seat without looking, I reminded myself that one day someone would need what I actually know. Evelyn's voice trembled, and today, I needed it. He nodded. You did. The garage lights flickered softly, casting shifting shadows across the dashboard. Outside the car, footsteps echoed faintly, staff arriving early, unaware that everything in their world had just changed. Evelyn looked up again, her expression open in a way Malcolm had never seen. Why didn't you tell me any of this? Any of it at all? He gave a small, almost sad smile. Ms. Lockhart, would you have listened? The question was not sharp, not cruel. It was simply true, and it landed like a gentle stone in a quiet pond, creating ripples that could not be ignored. A notification chimed suddenly from Evelyn's phone. Her assistant Clara had sent a message. The Marita advance team just arrived. They're in the lobby. Evelyn inhaled shakily and opened the door. As she stepped out into the cool garage air, she paused. Slowly, deliberately, she turned back to him. Malcolm, she said softly, the first time she had ever spoken his name with real intention. Will you help me save my company? He rose from the driver's seat, straightening the navy jacket that had become his silent uniform for 4 years. His posture was calm, steady, composed. Let's save those jobs, he answered. And the two of them walked toward the elevator, no longer separated by glass, but by a story that had finally begun to be told. The air inside the underground garage still carried the weight of everything Malcolm had revealed. But there was no time left to sit with the truth. The elevator doors closed behind them, sealing away the quiet of the car. As the two ascended toward the executive floor, the morning city buzzed awake outside, unaware that a single conversation in a parked sedan had just shifted the fate of a corporation. When the doors slid open, Evelyn's phone lit up instantly with a flood of new messages. Her assistant Clara had written, Morita Bandari calling again. Urgent! They want immediate clarification before leaving their hotel. Another message followed seconds later. Their translator is stuck in traffic. They may cancel the preliminary briefing without one. Evelyn's face paled. The entire merger, worth $1.4 billion, depended on smoothing the tensions from yesterday's misunderstandings. But without an interpreter, she would be walking into a minefield blindfolded. She hesitated for a moment, then turned to Malcolm. a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. If they call, can you... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The phone rang. The name glowed across the screen in bold letters. Kenji Morita. Evelyn exhaled sharply, then handed the phone to Malcolm with a slow, trembling hand. "Please," she whispered. Malcolm clicked the answer button with the calm of someone who had been navigating crises longer than anyone in the building. "Hayes speaking," he said in flawless Japanese, bowing his head instinctively even though the caller couldn't see him. His tone shifted subtly, no longer the gentle cadence he used in English, but the precise, formal rhythm reserved for elders and leaders in Japanese culture. Morita's voice came through tense, clipped, signaling disappointment with the documents Lockhart had sent and anxiety about whether they could move forward. Malcolm responded with sentences steady as a river's flow, offering apologies with the quiet dignity expected in high-context cultures. No jargon, no corporate bluster, just respect. He mirrored Morita's concerns back to him in a way that acknowledged them fully, then guided him toward a shared path forward. Evelyn watched, mesmerized. She had heard interpreters before, fast, competent, efficient, but this was different. Malcolm didn't merely translate meaning. He carried emotion, context, and unspoken cultural layers with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime listening between the lines. His voice dipped in humility where honor was needed, softened where reconciliation was possible, and rose ever so lightly when assurance could be offered. A second voice entered the call, someone from the technical advisory team, speaking in Mandarin. Malcolm responded instantly, shifting languages as smoothly as turning a page. The narrator translates the essence softly for the audience. He explained that Lockhart's software systems were built in a different structural pattern from the patents they feared conflicting with. Instead of overwhelming the listener with technical terminology, he used a simple metaphor. "Imagine two houses," he said in Mandarin. "They may look similar from the outside, but one is built on steel beams and the other on wooden supports. They cannot be mistaken for each other." The tension on the other end eased. Morita returned to the call, asking whether Lockhart understood the weight of entering a partnership expected to last half a century. The question wasn't truly about business. It was about loyalty, honor, and generational responsibility. Malcolm inhaled slightly before responding in Japanese, weaving in a brief story from his years abroad. He spoke of an elderly engineer he had once met who believed that long-term partnerships were like planting trees one would never see fully grown. It was a metaphor Morita understood instantly. His reply softened like thawing frost. Evelyn stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. In the span of only a few minutes, the man she had dismissed, insulted, and ignored for years was rescuing her company from disaster with nothing but his voice. After 18 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime, Malcolm placed the phone gently into her hand. "They are still committed to the meeting," he said quietly, "but they need reassurance in person." Evelyn stared at him, her eyes shimmering with something between awe and shame. That was extraordinary," she whispered. He nodded once without pride. "It's what I used to do." "Used to," she echoed softly, realizing how much had been taken from him and how much she had unknowingly stepped on. She gestured toward the hallway. "Walk with me, please. I want them to meet you." As they stepped out of the garage elevator and into the gleaming executive hallway, Evelyn's posture shifted. It wasn't the icy corporate armor she usually wore. nor the frantic trembling from the car. It was something new, something unsteady but honest. She walked beside Malcolm, not ahead of him, not above him. Clara hurried over, whispering that the Merida advance team had arrived early. Through the glass walls of a nearby conference room, 3 impeccably dressed Japanese executives waited with hands folded politely, their translator anxiously scanning last-minute notes. When Malcolm entered, the room seemed to realign itself. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like the soft click of a compass needle finding north. He bowed precisely, offering a greeting in formal Japanese that carried the measured cadence of deep respect. The translator froze, halfway through his own prepared introduction, realizing the dynamic had suddenly shifted. The executive straightened, meeting Malcolm's bow with equal depth. Evelyn watched from the side, her heart caught between gratitude and regret. She had never seen the conference room so quiet, so focused, so attuned. Malcolm moved effortlessly between Japanese and English, then seamlessly into Mandarin when a technical advisor joined the dialogue remotely. He answered questions not as a driver, not as a temporary hire, but as someone who had spent a life studying the invisible codes that form the backbone of diplomacy. He anticipated cultural pitfalls and softened them before they became obstacles. He asked questions that showed he had researched not only their company, but their family histories, understanding which stories mattered and which gestures would offend. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he chose words like a craftsman shaping something delicate. The room's atmosphere transformed. The executives, who had arrived wary, left with renewed confidence. One of them even remarked that Lockhart had finally sent someone who understood reverence, a compliment that carried a weight Evelyn herself did not fully comprehend. When the meeting concluded, Evelyn found herself at a loss. She followed Malcolm out into the hallway, ready to apologize, really apologize, for the years of blindness, the thoughtless words, the growing list of things she could no longer excuse. But Malcolm turned before she could speak. "Ms. Lockhart," he said gently, "we'll have time for apologies later. Right now, we need to prepare." The humility in his tone, the professionalism in his posture, and the quiet strength in his voice left her silently nodding. There was nothing she could say that would match the grace he had shown. And as they walked side by side down the corridor, no glass between them this time, Evelyn understood something she had been too proud to see. The man who had spent 4 years invisible was the only one who could make her company visible to the world again. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, but neither Malcolm nor Evelyn stepped out right away. They lingered for a brief moment in the brushed metal silence, each of them breathing in the strange new air that existed between them, an air no longer split by a sheet of glass. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't trust. It was something closer to truth, raw and unpolished, finally rising after being buried for 4 long years. When they did step out, Evelyn walked ahead only far enough to create space for a single, steady sentence. "I need to know the rest," she murmured, her voice softer than the click of her heels on the marble floor. "I need to understand who you are, everything I never asked." Malcolm inclined his head once, a gesture neither submissive nor proud, merely honest. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we should talk away from the noise." They returned to the parking level, not to the car this time, but to a quieter corner near the support columns where the faint hum of ventilation softened the echoes. The garage was nearly empty, the early morning light casting long shadows across the floor. Evelyn leaned lightly against a railing, arms folded not in defense but in an attempt to hold herself together. Malcolm stood a few steps away, hands clasped behind him with the relaxed posture of someone who had once been accustomed to briefing heads of state. She looked at him fully for the first time, really looked. Not the uniform, not the service role, him. "Tell me," she said, her voice catching. "Please." He studied her face for a moment, searching, perhaps, for sincerity or the depth of her regret. Whatever he found there must have been enough, because he began speaking in that calm, steady tone that made even the garage seem like a place where truth could settle gently. "I grew up in a small house filled with books," Malcolm said. "My mother, Beatrice, worked 2 jobs, but she made sure I had library cards before I had a bicycle. She believed languages were keys, that if I could speak to people in their own words, doors would open for me that stayed closed for others." He paused, his eyes drifting toward the far wall as if he could see his childhood through the concrete. "When I was 12, I taught myself my first new language. When I was 14, my second. By 18, a few more. Languages felt like music, each one with its rhythm, its heartbeat. They made the world feel less divided, more understandable." Evelyn swallowed. In her world, value came from power, position, visibility. The idea that someone could build an identity from understanding, quietly, patiently, felt foreign to her race toward achievement. After a breath, Malcolm continued. "I went to Stanford on a scholarship, Georgetown for my doctorate, Harvard afterward. I thought I would spend my whole life working in diplomacy, and for a long time I did. 25 years. Long enough to see governments rise and fall. Long enough to learn that peace isn't created in conference rooms. It's created in the moments in between, the quiet spaces where people choose whether to trust a voice." That line lingered. Even the flickering garage lights seemed to dim, as though the building itself wanted to listen. "I was there," Malcolm said softly, "in rooms where words mattered more than signatures. Trade agreements, climate resolutions, emergency negotiations, some of the most delicate conversations in the world. And I translated not just language but intent, fear, hope, anger. People forget that communication isn't simply transferring information. It's transferring emotion in a form someone else can understand." He stepped closer, his voice still calm. "I served alongside 4 presidents, not as someone in the spotlight, always in the background. But they trusted me, trusted that I could hold their meaning in one language and deliver it carefully in another. In those moments, I felt like I was doing something that mattered." Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly along the railing. Her eyes glistened, not with tears, not yet, but with the recognition that she had stood inches from this man for years without knowing any piece of this story. "So what happened?" she whispered. "What could possibly pull you out of that world?" Malcolm drew in a slow breath, his features softening at the edges. "A budget cut, something small in a government document, just a line that removed funding for a department. In an instant, my position was gone." He let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "They told me someone with my skills would find work easily. I believed them. I applied everywhere. 300 companies, maybe more. I received polite rejections, some not so polite. Overqualified. Too experienced. Salary expectation too high. I even got one email saying they feared I would intimidate younger staff." He shook his head slowly. "But life doesn't stop to wait for pride. My mother's treatments were expensive. My daughter, Maya, had just been admitted to medical school, and her happiness, her dream, was something I refused to let circumstances take from her. Evelyn's voice quivered when she asked, "So you took the driving job?" "Yes. It was the only position that would start paying within 2 weeks." He looked down, not ashamed, just reflecting. I told myself it was temporary, a bridge. But bridges can turn into long roads when the world has already decided who you are. She pushed a hand over her face. "And I treated you like—" He raised his hand gently, stopping her without anger. "Ms. Lockhart, you were dealing with pressure I saw even when you thought I wasn't watching. I understood, but understanding doesn't make things painless." A silence followed, not cold, not harsh, simply truthful. Then she asked the question that had weighed on her chest since the elevator. "Why didn't you tell me? Even once? Even by accident?" His answer was soft, almost tender. "Because conversations have their own language, a language of timing, a language of power, and a language of permission. You never spoke the kind that invited truth from someone like me." He let that settle before adding with a faint smile, "But today, you asked." Evelyn felt the weight of those words pressed directly onto her conscience. She thought of all the times she barked orders into the back of his headrest. All the meetings she conducted in the car without acknowledging the man who heard every detail. All the nights he waited in cold garages so she could finish dinners with executives who had never heard his name. She exhaled, a soft shaking sound. "Malcolm, I was wrong." He nodded once. "I know." "And rude." "Yes." "And blind." He hesitated, then said gently, "People often are, until they're ready to see." Her throat tightened. "I see now." Before Malcolm could answer, Clara's voice echoed faintly from the upper level, calling that the executives were waiting. Malcolm straightened his jacket. His posture shifted again, not back into the quiet compliance of a driver, but into the calm strength of someone who had stood in rooms where history turned with a few words spoken well. Evelyn stepped beside him, matching his pace for the first time. "Whatever you need," she said softly. "Whatever will help. I'll follow your lead." The corner of his mouth lifted. "Then let's go bring this company back from the edge." And together, they headed toward the stairs. No longer two strangers separated by roles, but two people walking toward the same impossible task, united by the truth finally spoken in a quiet corner of a parking garage. The walk back toward the elevators felt slower than it should have, as though every step between the dim parking garage and the brightly polished executive floor carried not just movement, but meaning. The echoes of their footsteps followed them, soft and uneven, mirroring the fragile new understanding unfolding between them. When they reached the elevator, Evelyn pressed the button with a trembling hand. She didn't speak. Neither did Malcolm. Words had already done enough heavy lifting in the last hour. When the door slid open, the two stepped inside. The small space closed around them with a quiet whoosh, dim lights flickering gently along the walls. It was strange how different the elevator felt now. For 4 years, this metal box had transported them together countless times, yet they had never truly shared it. One stood in front, one behind. One gave orders, the other obeyed. The silence back then had been a wall. Today, it felt like a bridge unsure of its own strength. As the elevator climbed, Evelyn released a slow breath. "You said earlier that you spent years in Tokyo," she murmured, unable to contain her curiosity. What was it like?" Malcolm rested a hand lightly on the railing as the floor numbers glowed upward. "Different," he replied. quiet in ways that teach you to listen. The first thing I learned there wasn't vocabulary or grammar, it was patience. In Japan, silence isn't a gap in conversation. It's part of the conversation. Sometimes the most important meaning rests inside the quiet. She nodded slowly, taking that in. And Beijing? That, he said with a faint smile, taught me speed. Negotiations there often moved like a river right before a storm. Fast, unpredictable, powerful. You learn to follow currents without losing yourself. You learn that directness can be a form of respect, and you learn not to mistake urgency for carelessness. The narrator softens the explanation here, describing Malcolm's transitions between cultures not as technical feats, but as emotional landscapes. Places shaped by rhythm rather than rules, by understanding rather than instruction. What about Geneva? Evelyn pressed gently. I've never been. Malcolm's eyes warmed with a kind of distant light. That was where the world came to argue and to hope. Climate talks, trade talks, human rights discussions. Everyone brought their fears to that city. Fears about shrinking resources, shifting borders, rising seas. Translating there wasn't just about words. It was about carrying fragile truths from one side of a table to the other without cracking them. He paused, his gaze softening. Sometimes, late at night, after sessions went on for 12 hours, diplomats would speak not as representatives of nations, but as exhausted human beings. They'd talk about their families, their worries, what they believed might happen if agreements failed. And in those moments, I realized something. Most people don't want power. They want safety. They want their children to live in a world that doesn't collapse under them. The elevator continued climbing quietly. The hum of the machinery blended with the steady rhythm of Malcolm's voice. Evelyn leaned slightly against the mirrored wall, absorbing his words the way one might absorb truth spoken in a dark theater. Carefully, slowly, knowing it might sting before it settles. And Washington? She asked. You mentioned serving 4 presidents. Malcolm's smile shifted into something more bittersweet. That taught me composure. Presidents rely on people who won't break under pressure. People who can stand behind them as the world watches, carrying the weight of meaning on their shoulders. You learn how to read faces. You learn how to sense when a sentence is too strong or too weak, or carrying the wrong implication entirely. He lifted his eyes toward the floor numbers glowing overhead. But you also learn that power is lonely. Even the most confident leaders need someone who can reflect their intent clearly. Someone who knows when to speak and when to step aside. Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. And yet, with all that experience, you ended up here, with me, driving. The question wasn't accusatory, not now. It carried a sadness she hadn't meant to reveal. Malcolm didn't look offended. He simply folded his hands lightly in front of him. In diplomacy, he said quietly, you learn that life turns on small hinges, a single line in a budget document, a single administrative change. You can go from the center of a negotiation to forgotten paperwork overnight. He looked at her fully then, a man who had seen the world in all its complications, standing inside a steel box beside someone who had only just glimpsed the edges of his story. When my job disappeared, he continued, I didn't have the luxury of waiting for a perfect opportunity. My mother needed treatment. Maya needed tuition. And He hesitated, letting the truth settle. I needed to keep going, even if that meant driving, even if that meant silence. Evelyn swallowed hard. I wish I had known. He tilted his head slightly. Would it have changed anything? She didn't answer. The truth was too heavy and too clear. The elevator chimed softly, signaling the halfway point to the executive floor. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, gripping the railing. "Malcolm," she said hesitantly, "all this time, all these years you sat in front of me, listening to me complain about things that must have sounded ridiculous compared to what you used to handle." He offered a small, gentle smile. "Pressure is relative, Ms. Lockhart. Pain is relative. You carried your world the only way you knew how, and I carried mine." Her voice trembled. "But I treated you as if—" He lifted a hand slowly, stopping her once again without harshness. "It doesn't matter what you did then. What matters is what you choose to do now." The elevator continued its steady ascent, the soft hum enveloping them like a quiet reminder that time moves whether people are ready or not. The air between them grew thicker with things they both wanted to say, but could not yet form into words. Finally, Evelyn asked, If things had been different, if someone had asked you early on who you really were, would you have stayed in diplomacy?" Malcolm considered the question carefully. "Maybe," he said at last, "but maybe not. I learned something driving for you that I never learned in all my years abroad." Evelyn blinked, startled. "What could you possibly have learned from driving me?" He turned to her with a quiet expression that carried no resentment, only honesty. "I learned how invisible talented people can become when the world decides their value based on uniforms, titles, or the angles from which people bother to look." The truth of that sentence landed gently but deeply. Before Evelyn could respond, the elevator chimed again. They had reached the executive floor. She stepped out first, not because she wanted to lead, but because she suddenly felt unsteady. Malcolm followed, his presence steady as ever. The office lights shone brighter than the garage, almost harsh in their clarity, and Evelyn realized that from this moment on, every person they encountered would see Malcolm in a new way. And she would have to decide, every moment, whether she would follow his lead into this unfamiliar terrain of humility, respect, and overdue recognition. "Come," she said, her voice now soft but firm. "The board needs to meet you." Malcolm nodded. "Then let's give them something worth listening to." The executive floor hummed with the hushed intensity of a building preparing for a battle no one wanted to lose. Assistants hurried past with tablet screens glowing in their hands. Printers whispered in the background, and the low murmur of conversations behind glass walls signaled that the clock was already running faster than anyone could catch. In the distance, through the transparent conference room panels, 3 impeccably dressed Japanese executives waited with calm posture and patient eyes. Their translator clutched a binder so tightly that the papers inside bent at the edges. Evelyn slowed her steps, suddenly aware of something she had never noticed before. The entire floor felt like a stage, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure how to walk across it. The weight of her position, the authority, the expectations, the pride, felt strangely heavier now that she'd seen how easily it could crumble without the right words spoken in the right way. Malcolm stood beside her, adjusting the cuffs of the navy suit Clara had found for him. It fit him surprisingly well, as if that suit, rather than the driver's uniform, had always been the one that matched the quiet strength beneath his calm exterior. When he exhaled, it wasn't nerves. It was preparation. A settling of breath familiar to anyone about to step into a room where every gesture matters. Clara approached with a clipboard hugged to her chest. "They're ready," she whispered. her eyes lingering on Malcolm with a kind of curious respect. Everyone on the floor had heard fragments, rumors of a driver speaking to Morita in flawless Japanese, rumors of him fielding technical questions in Mandarin. But this was the first time they would see him in action. Evelyn's hand brushed briefly against the conference room door. She hesitated, then exhaled softly. "Are you sure?" she asked Malcolm, her voice nearly lost in the hum around them. He offered a quiet, reassuring smile. "This," he said gently, "is the part I used to do every day." Her chest tightened, not in fear, but in a feeling she couldn't yet name. Gratitude, perhaps, or humility. She opened the door. Inside, the room brightened with the soft glow of morning sun reflecting off the glass table. The Japanese executives rose in unison, dipping their heads politely. Their movements were precise, practiced, almost ceremonial. The translator stepped forward, preparing to introduce everyone, though his nervous hands betrayed his composure. But Malcolm was already bowing. His movement was exact. The angle, the timing, the stillness. Not the kind of bow learned from books or films, but the kind shaped by years of immersion, by being welcomed into rooms where tradition guided everything from seating arrangements to the depth of a greeting. "Good morning," Malcolm said in formal Japanese, his tone respectful, warm, and measured. "Thank you for coming early. We appreciate your time and your patience." The executives blinked, their expressions registering gentle surprise. The translator froze mid-step, his introduction dissolving in his throat. He lowered his binder slowly, recognizing that his role had shifted in an instant. Evelyn watched the exchange as if witnessing a magician reveal the secret to an impossible trick. But it wasn't magic. It was mastery. Quiet, earned, lived-in mastery. Malcolm stepped to the table, inviting the executives to sit. The translator joined them, but remained silent, watching carefully as Malcolm guided the rhythm of the room like someone weaving a familiar melody. "Your concerns from yesterday were understandable," Malcolm continued in Japanese. "We regret the misinterpretations in tone. Cultural respect must be mutual, and we want to do better." The oldest executive, Mr. Morita's cousin, offered a nod of appreciation. He spoke softly about how letters from Lockhart Dynamics had sounded abrupt, even dismissive, in the way they addressed the company's lineage and long-term values. Malcolm translated gently for Evelyn, softening the edges of the criticism without altering its meaning. A diplomatic skill that carried emotional weight without losing clarity. Evelyn braced herself. She was used to feedback wrapped in corporate politeness, not the delicate sincerity of a culture that valued honesty delivered with courtesy. Malcolm's translation allowed her to hear the truth without flinching. When the discussion shifted to technology, a remote advisor from the Chinese side joined through video. He spoke quickly in Mandarin, explaining concerns about compatibility and intellectual property. Malcolm responded immediately, matching the man's pace, then offered a translated summary in English that stripped the technical details into soft, comprehensible imagery. "Imagine," he said calmly, "you're building two bridges over the same river. They have similar shapes, but one is anchored in concrete and the other in steel. They look alike from a distance, but they rest on completely different foundations. That is how our systems differ from the patents in question." The advisor nodded, satisfied. The executives exchanged glances of relief. A delicate moment arrived when the delegates asked about gift protocols. In their culture, a gift chosen without care could signal disrespect. They worried that Lockhart might misinterpret tradition as formality. Malcolm listened, then spoke with unusual depth. "To honor your legacy," he said softly, is to acknowledge not only the success of your present, but the sacrifices of your past. He then asked questions about Mr. Morita's family story, details he remembered from diplomatic archives, stories he respected enough not to embellish. The executives were visibly moved. Their translator whispered a quiet, incredible under his breath. Evelyn observed everything: the posture of the men, the shifting tone of the conversation, the way the mood slowly warmed like the first rays of sun through frost. She realized that Malcolm wasn't guiding them with authority. He was guiding with understanding, and that was what made people follow him. After nearly an hour of layered discussion, the meeting's tension dissolved. The delegates stood, bowing with genuine respect this time. One of them spoke to Malcolm in Japanese before switching to English for Evelyn's benefit. "Your company," he said kindly, "has finally sent someone who understands our heart." When they left, the room remained quiet for a long moment. Evelyn turned to Malcolm, awe softening her features. "I need to apologize," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "Not yet. We have work to do." She closed her mouth but nodded, accepting his terms without resistance. Outside the conference room, employees who had passed by during the meeting pretended not to stare, though their eyes followed Malcolm with a mix of amazement and curiosity. In a single morning, the most invisible man in the building had become the most essential. As they walked down the hallway, Evelyn murmured, "How did I never see any of this?" Malcolm's answer was soft, holding neither bitterness nor pride. "Sometimes," he said, "people look through the window, not at the person cleaning the glass." She felt that sentence settle deep inside her, uncomfortable, honest, and entirely deserved. "Then let's make sure we never miss the person again," she whispered. And together, they moved toward the next meeting, the next test, the next moment where truth might finally begin to reshape the world inside Lockhart Dynamics. The corridor leading to the main boardroom was long and bright, lined with framed photographs of Lockhart Dynamics at its proudest moments. Groundbreaking ceremonies, product launches, shareholder celebrations. Evelyn had walked this hallway thousands of times, often with a purposeful stride that signaled confidence. Today, her steps were slower, not hesitant, simply aware. Aware that the people framed on these walls had never included the man walking beside her, even though his skills could have shaped every one of those victories. When they reached the tall glass doors of the boardroom, Evelyn took a quiet breath, straightened her blazer, and pushed them open. Inside, the board was already assembled. A long, polished table stretched out like a glossy runway of expectation, flanked by chairs filled with people whose names carried weight in the corporate world. Daniel Mercer, the executive vice president with a gaze sharp as a scalpel. Robert Gaines, the numbers-obsessed chief financial officer. Linda Bowman, head of marketing with a reputation for impeccable presentation. And several other department heads, each sitting straighter than usual as Evelyn entered. Their eyes followed her first, then shifted to Malcolm. It was subtle but unmistakable. A flicker of confusion, then a quick attempt to correct expressions that bordered on disbelief. They recognized him, of course. They had seen him holding open doors for visiting partners, carrying Evelyn's luggage during off-site meetings, waiting silently in the corner during late-night crisis calls. But recognizing someone was not the same as knowing them. And today, they would discover the painful difference. "Good morning," Evelyn began, her voice steady, though slightly softer than usual. I've called this meeting because we're moving into the final preparation stage for the Morita-Bhandari merger. Before the main signing ceremony tomorrow, we need alignment, clarity, and our strongest team in place. Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making the room bend around him. Agreed. So where's the interpreter? I heard the agencies were all booked. Evelyn didn't look away. We have one. The board murmured with relief until she continued. He is already here. She turned slightly, a gesture that offered Malcolm the space beside her. For a heartbeat, the room didn't breathe. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, this is Malcolm Hayes. He will serve as lead interpreter and cultural liaison for the merger discussions. A faint wave of disbelief rippled across the room, not loud, but deep. A few eyebrows lifted. Robert Gaines blinked rapidly. Linda Bowman's mouth opened in surprise before she caught herself, and Daniel Mercer stared at Malcolm with a look that wasn't hostile, but unquestionably skeptical. He cleared his throat. Evelyn, with all due respect, Malcolm has been driving you for years. How does that translate into this? Evelyn held his stare. He is fluent in 10 languages. He has served as a senior diplomatic interpreter for multiple presidential administrations. He once mediated negotiations in Tokyo and Beijing that shaped international trade frameworks. And yesterday, he stabilized the Morita-Bhandari delegation when the deal was minutes from collapse. Silence. Then Daniel spoke again, choosing his words carefully. That's impressive, but appearances matter here. The delegates expect a certain image, someone polished, someone who... He stopped, but the meaning dangled in the air. Someone who doesn't look like him. Someone who doesn't come from the driver's seat. Someone who fits the image you're comfortable honoring. Malcolm didn't flinch. His posture remained calm, almost serene, as he stepped forward. With respect, he said gently, if the concern is appearance, I assure you that integrity and understanding will always matter more to our partners than the cut of my suit. Linda cleared her throat. It's not just appearance. There are protocols, formalities, details we can't afford to get wrong. Malcolm nodded, acknowledging her point rather than dismissing it. What specific details do you feel most uncertain about? The board hesitated. Then Daniel spoke first. Well, seating arrangements. Who sits opposite whom? And how deep the bow should be. I've heard it matters. Malcolm answered with quiet clarity. For the Morita side, the order should follow founding dates, not revenue. Mr. Morita should be seated where tradition places the patriarchal authority, even though he's not the oldest in the room. As for bowing, the depth communicates respect proportional to generational legacy, not social rank. And the Bhandari side values efficiency. They will see overly elaborate ceremony as a distraction rather than an honor. The explanations were simple, soft, unburdened by academic phrasing. The board members exchanged looks. Linda leaned forward. How do you know all that? Because I spent 5 years in Tokyo, Malcolm replied, and another 2 in Beijing. I helped negotiate the early intellectual property frameworks that Lockhart still relies on. I mediated the Bhandari banking dispute during my Geneva posting. I've spent a lifetime listening to what people mean beneath what they say. The room fell completely still. Daniel's tone softened, but a flicker of discomfort remained. So you're really the right person for this? Malcolm offered a quiet smile. I'm the right person because I know their language, not just their vocabulary. Those words hung in the air like a truth the room finally had permission to hear. For the first time, Robert Gaines spoke. "If you can actually repair the damage from that last email exchange, you'll save us a fortune." Evelyn stepped in. "He already has. The delegation is attending tomorrow, and they trust him more than anyone on our side." The board exchanged glances again. Small nods followed, some reluctant, some respectful, and one or two carrying the weight of apology that had not yet been spoken aloud. Evelyn straightened. "Before we close this meeting, there's one more matter." She lifted a folder from the table and opened it. Inside lay a contract printed fresh that morning. "Effective immediately," she said, her voice firm but warm. "Malcolm Hayes is appointed Senior Vice President of International Relations. He will report directly to me and oversee a newly formed Cultural Intelligence Division. His starting salary will be $210,000, with equity and decision authority appropriate to the role." The board audibly inhaled. Some looked stunned. Others nodded slowly. Daniel opened his mouth to object, but found no ground to stand on. "If he can save this merger, then he deserves it," he finally said. Linda Bowman added softly, "And perhaps more than it." Robert raised a hand slightly. "Mr. Hayes, welcome to the team." The words were tentative, but sincere. Malcolm bowed his head in acknowledgement, not in submission but in gratitude. A gratitude that didn't erase the past, but gently welcomed the possibility of a better future. As the meeting adjourned, Evelyn lingered beside Malcolm. "You handled them with more grace than I've managed in years," she whispered. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Diplomacy is mostly about understanding what people fear and offering them a path through it." "And what about you?" she asked softly. "What did you fear?" "I feared," Malcolm said, "that my skills would disappear in silence, that no one would ever ask who I truly was." He turned toward the hallway, adjusting the jacket Clara had chosen for him. "But today," he added, "someone finally did." And for the first time, Evelyn realized she was not leading him out of the room. She was walking alongside him. The sun was long gone when the last wave of executives finally left the building, their footsteps echoing faintly through the marble corridor like tired punctuation marks after a too long sentence. By the time the office quieted, only two pools of light remained: the soft glow above Evelyn's desk and the warm, steady lamp illuminating the conference table where Malcolm now sat, surrounded by an ocean of documents. He wasn't slumped or hurried. He worked with the gentle precision of someone restoring a fragile artifact, careful, focused, utterly devoted to the task. Before him lay a constellation of folders, each color-coded, each representing someone in tomorrow's meeting. A blue folder for Kenji Morita, outlining family lineage going back generations. Notes about the grandfather who rebuilt their first factory after the war. The uncle who taught business as service rather than conquest. The aunt whose artwork once hung in a museum Malcolm had visited during his posting in Tokyo. He didn't read the details as trivia. He held them as threads in a tapestry of meaning. A green folder for Anaya Bhandari, filled with notes from her years in London and Mumbai, her preference for clarity, her dislike of unnecessary ceremony, her reputation for trusting people who respect her time. There were pages about the Bhandari family's long involvement in banking, stories about their rebuilding efforts after regional financial crises, and the cultural symbolism behind the gifts she once gave to a partner she admired. A yellow folder for Dr. Liang Zhao and the technical advisory team, summaries of how Chinese engineers often described software architecture as building cities of logic, a phrase Malcolm had always loved. He'd translated it countless times, each translation unique to the person hearing it. Even Evelyn had a folder, white, slim, filled with what Malcolm had quietly learned from 4 years watching her navigate storms. Her tendency to overwork, the way she pressed her thumb to her temple when stressed, her need for control, her rare but sincere compassion hidden beneath layers of corporate armor. Evelyn stepped into the room as quietly as the click of the door permitted. She had changed out of her blazer, her sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back loosely. She looked less like a CEO and more like a person who'd been carrying too much for too long. "You're still here," she said, though she already knew the answer. "So are you," Malcolm replied, not looking up as he placed a thin sheet into the Morita folder. "What is all this?" she asked softly. "Preparation," he answered, "the kind that doesn't show up in presentations." She approached the table, eyes widening at the meticulous layout. "You made all this today?" "No," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "I've been making it for years." She froze. "For years?" she echoed. He nodded. "Every time you made a call in the back seat, every time you rehearsed a pitch, every time a crisis unfolded while I drove you to a meeting, I listened, and I took note of every misunderstanding, every avoidable lost deal, every time a cultural nuance slipped through the cracks." He reached beneath the table and pulled out a thicker binder labeled Missed Opportunities. Evelyn's breath caught. He opened it gently, as if revealing the quiet history of a company too busy to notice its own blind spots. "There was the Korean partnership," he said, flipping to a tabbed section. "You addressed the chairman's father informally. In Korean culture, that felt disrespectful. They withdrew 2 months later." Evelyn winced. "And the Berlin deal," he continued, turning another page. "The contracts were sent in untranslated American legal language. The phrasing came across as dismissive. They felt you didn't take them seriously." She rubbed her forehead. "I didn't know." "That's the point," he said, not unkindly. "You weren't supposed to know. But someone on your team should have." He closed the binder, letting the silence settle. "Evelyn," he said gently, "you have vision, ambition, and drive. But international partnerships require something else. Translation. Not just of language, but of intent." She felt the truth of that settle into her bones. Before she could respond, Malcolm's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and answered immediately, shifting posture. "Patel," he said in Hindi, his voice dipping into the familiar cadence of another world. Evelyn watched, mesmerized, as Malcolm's tone shifted from gentle warmth to the firm calm of crisis management. On the other end, Raghav Patel spoke rapidly, his voice edged with panic. Another attempted breach in the Mumbai office. Security teams confused. Fear of losing intellectual property. After everything Malcolm had stabilized today, the threat of losing trust now would destroy the merger before morning. Malcolm guided Patel step by step, his Hindi steady enough to anchor the frantic voice on the other end. He instructed him how to lock down access, how to timestamp every suspicious action, how to draft a message for Anaya that would show control rather than fear. His tone soothed, reassured, and commanded, all at once. When the crisis settled, he switched seamlessly back into English. "Breached attempt contained. No data lost. They'll prepare a formal log for tomorrow." Evelyn stared at him. "You, just speak it. As easily as breathing." He smiled gently. Languages were my first safe place. They still are. Before Evelyn could reply, another call arrived, this one from Berlin. She almost laughed in disbelief at the timing. Malcolm answered in German, and instantly his voice brightened with easy camaraderie. Old partners, curious about the merger, wanting to reopen discussions on a $55 million collaboration. Malcolm set a meeting for next week, his tone warm like greeting an old friend. When the call ended, Evelyn shook her head slowly. How much business have we lost because we didn't know how to speak to people? Malcolm looked down at the table. More than the numbers suggest. He handed her a thick binder labeled Tomorrow. Inside were strategies for seating, gift selection, phrasing, tone, and cultural sensitivities, not presented as restrictions, but as bridges. Evelyn touched the first page reverently. Everything we need. Malcolm nodded. Everything they'll expect. Everything that will show we're partners, not desperate. She looked at him quietly for a moment. Why are you doing all this? After everything I said, everything I ignored, Because 240 people rely on this deal, he answered simply. And because sometimes the world gives you one moment to reclaim the person you almost forgot you were. It took a long breath for Evelyn to find her voice again. Malcolm, she said. I don't know how to thank. He shook his head. Save it for tomorrow. Tonight, we work. The room dimmed as the building settled into its nighttime quiet. Papers rustled softly under Malcolm's hands. Outside, the city glowed with the promise of sleep, unaware that inside this glass-walled office, a man once invisible was stitching together the threads that might save an entire company. Evelyn sat beside him, and for the first time, they worked not as CEO and driver, not as superior and subordinate, but as partners. Two people holding together the fragile possibility of a new dawn. Morning light spilled across the 32nd floor with the kind of quiet confidence only a sunrise could offer. It pushed gently through the glass walls, warming the long boardroom table where a merger, fragile, enormous, and utterly essential, was about to be decided. The room had been prepared with meticulous care, nameplates aligned to perfection, small bowls of traditional gifts placed at respectful angles, and a faint scent of jasmine tea drifting from a discreet corner, chosen purposefully because it carried notes of welcome in both Japanese and Indian custom. Evelyn stood near the window, staring down at the city as if it were a sea she needed to cross. Her reflection looked different today, not the armor of a CEO who expected obedience, but the quieter resolve of someone who finally understood the weight of her mistakes. She was afraid, but she was also ready. And she was not alone. Malcolm entered the room with the calm posture of a man walking into a space he had spent a lifetime preparing for. He had exchanged his navy suit for a deeper charcoal tone, one that carried gravitas without drawing unnecessary attention. His movements were quiet, precise, deliberate, each step taken with the confidence of someone who had stood behind presidents, yet never needed to be seen to understand his role. Evelyn turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. This deal, if it fails. He finished the sentence for her, gently but firmly. 240 families lose their stability, and Lockhart Dynamics runs out of air. He paused. We know what's at stake. She swallowed. I keep thinking about what you said last night, about one moment to reclaim who you used to be. Malcolm gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Then let's make sure we don't waste it. They moved toward the center of the room just as the first members of the Morita delegation entered. Kenji Morita himself, dignified, gracious, accompanied by two senior advisors, walked with the quiet certainty of someone carrying generations behind him. The weight of his family legacy was visible even in the set of his shoulders. Behind them came Anaya Bhandari, crisp and direct, her steps fast, her gaze sharper than the edge of a blade. She was a woman who had negotiated more contracts before breakfast than most people did in a month. She was accompanied by her assistant, Dev Mehta, who carried a tablet filled with color-coded documents. They exchanged formal greetings in English, brief, cordial, professional. Then Malcolm stepped forward. He bowed to Morita with the exact depth that honored both age and position. "Morita-san," he said in flawless Japanese, "thank you for the honor of welcoming your delegation today. We have prepared carefully to acknowledge the significance of this moment." Morita's eyes softened. "Hey-san," he replied. "Your voice carries the respect of someone who has lived in our world. We are grateful." To Anaya, Malcolm shifted into Hindi, not boastfully, not loudly, but with a warm, respectful cadence. "We appreciate your time and your willingness to continue despite yesterday's concerns." Anaya blinked, surprised, then nodded with genuine appreciation. "You speak it well," she said. "Not many do." "And fewer bother to learn," Malcolm replied gently. The room settled, chairs slid quietly into place, and the meeting began. The narrator slows, not for suspense, but to match the steady rhythm of what unfolds. A rhythm built on attention, understanding, and the quiet tension beneath every cross-cultural negotiation. The first hour proceeded smoothly. Opening remarks, clarifications, restatements of key terms. Evelyn did her best to follow the structure Malcolm had prepared, adjusting her tone when needed, taking pauses where silence was more respectful than speech. Occasionally, she glanced at Malcolm to confirm she hadn't made a misstep. His small nods guided her like soft lights along a dark path. But important meetings rarely stay peaceful. Crisis 1 arrived quietly, an unexpected vibration from Anaya's phone. She read a message, her face tightening. "Our security team in Mumbai," she said, "reports that your company's protections may not meet the standard required for shared operations. They are concerned about exposure." Her tone was cool, the way someone speaks when preparing to withdraw. Evelyn felt her heart drop, but Malcolm leaned forward with calm authority. "If I may," he said. Anaya gestured for him to continue. Malcolm switched to Hindi, gently asking Dev for the message details. Dev read them aloud, surprised that Malcolm followed effortlessly. Malcolm then explained, in clear, soft English, that the attempted breach had occurred the previous evening, that it was neutralized using a stronger defense protocol than Bhandari's own baseline, and that the Mumbai director, Raghav Patel, had documented the entire sequence. He requested a live confirmation call. Within seconds, Patel appeared on the screen, greeting Malcolm in Hindi before summarizing the successful containment. His tone radiated confidence. Anaya exhaled, her shoulders eased. "That resolves the issue," she said. Crisis 1 dissolved like mist. Crisis 2 arrived soon after, carried in the careful voice of Kenji Morita. "For a partnership expected to last 50 years, he said slowly, "we must be sure Lockhart Dynamics understands the significance of legacy. Japan values relationships that outlive the people who form them." It was not an accusation, but the room held its breath. Malcolm replied in Japanese, his tone lowering into a more reverent register. He told a story, not of business, but of his father's role in a post-conflict reconstruction program, helping engineers from two once mistrustful nations rebuild damaged bridges together. He described how the partnerships forged in those days were built not on profit, but on responsibility. Quiet filled the room. Morita closed his eyes for a moment, as though honoring the memory. "Your father," he said softly, "would understand our values well." Crisis 2 passed. Crisis 3 was the most delicate of all. Dr. Liang Zhao raised his concern in Mandarin, a possible overlap between Lockhart's neural pattern software and existing Chinese patents. If true, the merger was over. Malcolm slid gently into Mandarin, studying Liang's diagrams. Instead of launching into technical argument, he softened the explanation into imagery. "Imagine," he said, "two lanterns casting light along the same path. The color may look similar, but the frames inside are built differently. They illuminate the same ground, yet they are not the same lantern." Liang reviewed the underlying logic, compared notes, and nodded slowly. "Your design," he concluded, "does not conflict with ours." Crisis 3 faded. The meeting continued for another hour. Questions asked, reassurances given, intentions clarified. And finally, after hours of weaving languages, cultures, and histories together, the room settled into a profound, unified calm. Then it happened. Kenji Morita stood. He reached into his briefcase and drew out a small, antique business card case made of lacquered wood with gold detailing. "This," he said in Japanese, "belonged to my father. I present it to you, Hei-san, because today you honored his principles." He bowed deeply. Malcolm bowed in return, holding the case against his chest. For a moment, the world around him blurred into a quiet glow. Next, Anaya rose. "We would like Malcolm to be the keynote speaker at our Global Partners Conference in Singapore next quarter," she said softly. 600 executives from 42 countries will benefit from hearing him. Evelyn swallowed emotion quietly. "That decision," she said, "is entirely his." When the final documents were agreed upon, the room felt lighter, reborn almost. A merger valued at $1.4 billion had found its anchor, not through force, not through pressure, through understanding. As they walked out of the boardroom, Evelyn whispered, "You didn't just save the deal, you changed everything." Malcolm glanced down at the antique case in his hand. "Sometimes," he replied, "saving one thing shows you the value of another." They stepped into the hallway side by side, no longer as CEO and driver, but as two people reshaping a company's future, one quiet conversation at a time. The hours after the merger felt strangely quiet, as if the building itself were pausing to acknowledge the shift in its own history. The boardroom lights dimmed, the hallway chatter softened, and those who passed Malcolm in the corridor no longer looked through him the way people look through reflections in glass. They looked at him, directly, respectfully, even with something close to gratitude. And for a man who had spent 4 years being treated as a shadow, that single shift in gaze meant more than applause ever could. But the day wasn't finished. Not yet. Evelyn called the board into a final meeting. Malcolm walked beside her, still holding the small antique card case Morita had given him. A gesture that felt as heavy as family and as fragile as memory. He ran his thumb lightly along its lacquered surface as they stepped back into the room where several hours earlier he had stood as an unexpected interpreter. Now he walked in as the man who had saved the company. The board members were already seated. Their expressions were different this time. Fewer raised brows, more softened eyes. A quiet understanding hovered among them, carrying the unspoken truth that something monumental had happened during the negotiations. Evelyn placed a folder on the table. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood at the head of the long, polished surface and met each person's gaze with a dignity that had grown gentler, deeper since yesterday. "Before we continue," she began, "I want to acknowledge what Mr. Hayes accomplished today." Everyone nodded, some more openly than others. Daniel Mercer, who had been the most skeptical earlier, folded his hands, a gesture that signaled something close to apology. Evelyn continued. "This company was on the brink, 5 months from collapse. And while many of us were fighting with spreadsheets, strategies, and projections, Malcolm was rescuing partners, calming cultural misunderstandings, and holding together international trust." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Truth spoken simply carries its own gravity. Then she opened the folder and slid a document toward Malcolm. "This," she said softly, "is your new contract. You are now Executive Vice President of Global Relations, with a salary of $320,000, a significant equity package making you the third largest individual shareholder in Lockhart Dynamics, and a $10 million annual budget to build the Cultural Intelligence Division as you see fit." The room remained silent for a heartbeat that felt like an exhale from the universe itself. Malcolm didn't move immediately. He looked down at the contract, not with triumph or disbelief, but with a quiet, reflective calm. He rested the antique card case beside it, letting the two objects sit side by side. The past he came from and the future he had earned, touching like two chapters meeting on the same page. He finally spoke. "Thank you," he said softly, not lifting his voice beyond the tone reserved for sincerity. "This isn't just for me. It's for every person whose abilities go unseen because the world judged them too quickly." Daniel cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology. Several, actually. You deserved more respect than I offered." Malcolm met his eyes with warmth. "What matters," he said, "is not the mistake. It's what you do after you understand it." A ripple of relief moved across the table. It wasn't forgiveness spoken loudly. It was forgiveness offered gently. One by one, every board member acknowledged their oversight, and Malcolm accepted each apology with the same grace he had shown throughout the negotiation. When the meeting adjourned, Evelyn lingered. "There's something else," she whispered. "Someone you should call." She offered her phone, not because his didn't work, but because she wanted to stand beside him for this. Malcolm dialed Maya. When she answered, her voice was bright with the exhausted enthusiasm of a medical student. "Dad, is everything okay?" He closed his eyes as a soft wave of emotion moved through him. "Everything is better than okay," he said. "I've been promoted, and your tuition, every year, it's taken care of. You never have to worry again." There was silence on the other end. Silence shaped not by confusion, but by relief so powerful it couldn't yet form words. Then her breath trembled through the line. "Dad," she whispered, "you did it." He swallowed. "We did it." When the call ended, he stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the truth that his daughter's future, her dream of treating children with cancer, was safe. Not postponed, not threatened. Safe. 8 months later, Malcolm's corner office overlooked the entire city. The walls were lined with maps, cultural guides, photographs from his foreign service years, and new snapshots of the cultural intelligence team he had assembled. 20 people from 15 countries, each fluent in the nuanced language of international partnership. 3 screens glowed on his desk, one showing a late-night call with Singapore, one displaying updates from Mumbai, and one capturing a meeting with Berlin. The division had already prevented 5 diplomatic disasters and generated over $400 million in new opportunities. Where misunderstandings once cost the company trust, there was now clarity, cooperation, and respect. And on his desk, centered carefully beneath a soft beam of light, rested 2 objects: his old driver's license, framed simply, and Marita's antique card case. The unlikely pairing told the whole story without speaking a single word. News of Malcolm's impact spread across the corporate world. Soon, CEOs began calling Evelyn and the new division with questions, not about deals, but about people. Stories surfaced: a janitor with a graduate degree in artificial intelligence, a barista who spoke 4 languages and once worked in diplomacy, a factory clerk with engineering patents she had never shown her supervisors. Malcolm and Evelyn created the Hidden Talent Initiative, a program quietly matching overlooked workers with companies who needed the skills they never realized they already had. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a trend. It was a movement rooted in dignity. Reporters asked Malcolm to appear on television. He declined. But when a documentary filmmaker requested a quiet interview about unseen talent, Malcolm agreed, not to highlight himself, but to speak to anyone who had ever been overlooked. The final moments of the documentary were filmed in his office, where he sat near the window overlooking the sprawling city he had once navigated only from behind the wheel. He spoke gently, as if addressing someone listening late at night. "You may think you know who the people around you are," he said. "But sometimes the person serving your coffee speaks 3 languages. The person cleaning your office might be an engineer. The person driving you may have once negotiated to prevent conflict between nations." He folded his hands slowly. "All any of us want is to be seen." Then he made one request. Not dramatic, not loud, but sincere enough to linger long after the screen faded. "If this story reaches you," he said, "find one person whose job title doesn't match their potential. Ask them what they dream of, and if you can, help open a door for them, even a small one." Evelyn appeared beside him, her voice soft. "And if you're someone whose talent has gone unheard," she said, "you deserve better. And sometimes the world changes because one person finally decides to look again." The camera captured the 2 objects on Malcolm's desk, his driver's license and the card case, before the screen gently faded to black, as though the story was settling itself to sleep.